Lookup functions allow you to take a value in one table, find it in another table, and return a corresponding value. There are two lookup functions that work in the same way. The first is VLOOKUP. You will use the VLOOKUP function when your data is organized in columns. The V stands for vertical because your data is organized vertically. The other lookup function is HLOOKUP. HLOOKUP is used when your data is organized in rows. The H stands for horizontal. In this tutorial, we will work a VLOOKUP function because it is more commonly used. HLOOKUP works in the same way as VLOOKUP, and completing this tutorial should prepare you to use an HLOOKUP function as well. There are two different types of VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP functions. The first is an exact match, and the second is an approximate match. An exact match will return information if the value you are looking for exactly matches a value in the other table. In an approximate match, the function will find the closest match in the other table without going over. This is an example of an exact match. In the table shown here, we have a product ID and the quantity ordered. We want to bring the price per unit into our table. We have another table that contains the product ID and the price per unit. Our VLOOKUP function will look at the product ID in the first table, find it in the second table, and return the corresponding price per unit. Then we can fill the formula down to return the price per unit in the other rows. This is an example of an approximate match. In our first table, we have student names and test scores. We want to know the letter grade that corresponds with the test score. Our second table shows how letter grades correspond with number grades. For each letter grade, we can see the number that is the lower limit for that grade. In the cell below the number grade, we can see the upper limit for that letter grade. The upper limit is not inclusive. In an approximate match, the table with the value being looked at must be sorted ascending by the lookup value. Our VLOOKUP function will take the grade, go through the entries in the second table until it finds the closest match without going over the lookup value. Then it will return the corresponding letter grade to the table. When we fill the formula down, we can see the letter grade for each student. Let's look at the syntax of a VLOOKUP function using the product ID and price per unit example we looked at earlier. The function starts with equals VLOOKUP and open parentheses. The first argument is the lookup value. This is the value you are looking for in the other table. In this case, it's our product ID. The second argument is the table array. The table array is the second table where we are looking for the lookup value. Here's an important rule to remember. The first column in your table array must contain the lookup value. Excel will only look in the first column of the table array for the lookup value. The third argument is the column index number. The first column of the table array always has a column index number of 1, even if it is not the first column in the worksheet. The argument column index number actually asks for the number of the column that contains the information you want to return. So in this case, our column index number is 2 because the second column contains the price per unit. The last argument in our VLOOKUP function is the range lookup. In the range lookup section, you enter true or false. You can substitute 1 for true and 0 for false. True will make your VLOOKUP an approximate match, meaning that Excel will find the closest value in the second table without going over the lookup value. False will make your VLOOKUP an exact match. If you do not enter anything for the range lookup argument, the default will be false. Let's look at an example of a VLOOKUP function in Excel. I'm going to use the keyboard to do this formula. If you aren't familiar with keyboard shortcuts, don't worry, I'll tell you everything I'm doing. First, let's look at our data. On the Employee tab of the workbook, we have an employee name and their ID. On the Supervisors tab of the workbook, we have the employee's hire date, their employee ID, and their supervisor. On the Employee tab, we want to return the supervisor's name for each employee in column C. To do this, we'll use a VLOOKUP function. I'll type equals V Excel suggests VLOOKUP for me, I'll press the Tab key to put in the rest of the VLOOKUP name and open parentheses. In the screen tip below, you can see that the first argument in the formula is the lookup value. The lookup value is the value we're looking for in the second table. In this case, it will be the employee ID. I arrowed 1 to the left to select B3, the employee ID. I'll type a comma, and we move on to the next argument in the formula, the table array. The table array is where we're looking for the employee ID. It's on the Supervisors tab in the workbook, so I'll press Control Page Down to move to the Supervisors tab of the workbook. Notice I still see my screen tip here. The first column in your table array must contain the lookup value. I'm going to press the down arrow key and it moves me down to A2. I'll press down again and then I'll arrow over to the first entry in the employee ID column. To select these, you could click and drag over the employee ID column and the supervisor column, but in this case, I'm going to press Control-Shift down arrow and Control-Shift right arrow to select. And notice I left out the column headers. You don't want to include column headers in your table array. Because I'm going to copy this formula down, I'll press F4 to make the cell references absolute. Then type a comma to move on to the next argument. The next argument is column index number. The column index number is the number of the column within the array that contains the value you want to return. So the first column in our table array is employee ID and the second column is supervisor. So I'll enter 2 as my column index number. I'll type a comma and the last argument is the range lookup. The range lookup is where we tell Excel whether we're doing an approximate match or an exact match. In this case, we're doing an exact match. I'll press the down arrow to move down to false in the menu that popped down below my screen tip, and I'll press the Tab key on the keyboard to enter false. Close parentheses and I'll press enter. It takes me back to the employee worksheet and I get my answer. I'll double click on the fill handle to fill the formula down, and now I have each employee's supervisor. Now let's do an approximate match VLOOKUP. In column D, we want to return the employee's region. The employee's ID number is created based on their region. So employees with an ID number between 1,000 and 1,999 work in the West region. Employees with an ID between 2,000 and 2,999 work in the East region, and so on for North and South. When you do an approximate match, the table setup for the table array is very important. You need to have the lower limit of your range next to the value you want to return. So in this case, since 1,000 is the lower limit for the West region, I'll edit this so that 1,000 is the value connected to West. I'll go through and do the same for the rest. So 2,000 is my lower limit for East, 3,000 is my lower limit for North, and 4,000 is my lower limit for South. Remember that the table array in an approximate match must be sorted ascending. In this case, it already is. In D3, I'll type equals VLOOKUP. I'll press the Tab key to let Excel fill the rest in. And I'll arrow to my lookup value, which is my employee ID. Type a comma and move on to the table array argument. I'll arrow 2 to the right to get to my table array. Control-Shift down arrow and Control-Shift right arrow to select them. Remember not to include the column headers, and press F4 to make the table array absolute. Type a comma to move on to the column index number. The region is in the second column of our table array, so I'll type 2 for column index number. Type a comma and move on to the range lookup. In this case, we're doing an approximate match, and true is the value for an approximate match. So I can type true, or you could select it from the menu that pops down below. Close parentheses and press enter, and you get the region for the first employee. I'll double click on the fill handle to fill down, and you can see that we're getting the correct region based on employee ID. This concludes the video for VLOOKUP functions. Thank you for watching.